The California sun catches the silver in his hair as Pierce Brosnan moves slowly along the Malibu shoreline, his once commanding frame now carrying 7 decades of life. Those familiar blue eyes, the same that once captured millions as James Bond, now gaze out at the Pacific with a weathered stillness. In his left hand, he clutches a small worn photograph, in his right, a paintbrush. At 72, the actor who embodied debonair invincibility on screen has outlived both his first wife and their daughter, both claimed by the same merciless disease. The man who built his career playing heroes who could save everyone now knows what it means to stand powerless against fate. But to understand how Pierce Brosnan arrived at this quiet, grief-etched shore, how the abandoned boy from County Meath became a global icon only to face losses that no amount of fame could shield him from, we must return to where it all began. This is the story of a man whose life has been defined by absence and presence, the father who vanished, the mother who had to leave him behind, the wife and daughter cancer stole, and the inner strength that allowed him to rebuild again and again. Pierce Brosnan's journey reveals how tragedy can both break and fortify a human heart, and how even those who seem to have everything remain vulnerable to life's cruelest turns. If this story moves you, tap like so others can find it, because beneath the glossy veneer of celebrity lies a tale of resilience that speaks to anyone who has ever had to find a way forward when the unimaginable happens. Navan, County Meath, Ireland, 1953. A small stone house on the banks of the River Boyne welcomes the birth of a boy named Pierce Brendan Brosnan. The post-war years in rural Ireland offered little luxury, but young Pierce's world seemed secure enough in those earliest days. That security, however, would prove heartbreakingly brief. When Pierce was barely an infant, his father Thomas abandoned the family, disappearing from their lives so completely that Pierce would grow up with no memory of the man's face, voice, or touch. "It's a wound that never heals," Brosnan would admit decades later, the pain still audible despite the years. "You're always that little boy waiting for your father to come home." The absence of his father was only the first fracture in what would become a childhood defined by separation. When Pierce was 4, his mother May moved to London to train as a nurse, a decision born of necessity rather than choice in economically depressed Ireland. Left behind with his maternal grandparents, Pierce existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for weekend visits that often couldn't materialize due to his mother's demanding schedule. "I lived with my grandparents who were quite elderly," Pierce recalled in interviews years later. "I slept in their bedroom because there was no other place for me. They died within a year of each other when I was very young." After his grandparents passed. Away, Pierce bounced between relatives and boarding houses, never quite belonging anywhere. By the time he was 11, he was finally reunited with his mother in London, but found himself in an unfamiliar country with a stepfather he didn't know. The Irish Catholic boy with the lilting accent now stood out painfully among his English peers. One gray London afternoon in 1964, 11-year-old Pierce sat alone in the back row of the Granada Cinema in Putney. On screen, James Bond, played by Sean Connery in Goldfinger, moved through the world with a confidence and purpose the lonely boy couldn't imagine. For those 2 hours, Pierce forgot his outsider status, forgot the father who had vanished, forgot the mother who had been forced to leave. "It was the first time I'd seen a Bond film," Brosnan would later recall. "Little did I know I would be playing the character all those years later." When the lights came up, something had shifted in the boy. The seed of not just an ambition, but an escape had been planted. If he couldn't control the circumstances of his life, perhaps he could become someone else through acting, someone untouchable, someone who couldn't be hurt or abandoned. After leaving school at 16, Pierce drifted through odd jobs: fire eater at a circus, illustrator, photographer's assistant. But the pull of performance grew stronger. At 20, he applied to the Drama Centre London, a prestigious acting school known for its grueling method techniques. "They broke you down to build you back up," he would explain of the training that forced him to confront the abandonment that shaped him. "There was nowhere to hide, not from your feelings, not from your fears. It was terrifying and liberating all at once." In those early acting classes, Pierce found that the wounds of his childhood, the absences that had defined him, could be transformed into something powerful on stage. The boy who had learned to swallow his emotions now had permission to express them. The outsider finally had somewhere to belong. But as he began to build this new identity, Pierce could not have known that the pattern of his early life, finding stability only to have it ripped away, would repeat itself with devastating consequences in the decades to come. London, 1979. A 26-year-old Pierce Brosnan walks into an audition for Tennessee Williams, nervous but determined. His quiet intensity catches the eye of not just the director, but of Australian actress Cassandra Harris, already established in the industry and 7 years his senior. Their eyes meet across the room, a moment Pierce would later describe as thunderbolt stuff, love at first sight. Within a year, they were married. Pierce adopted Cassandra's children, Charlotte and Christopher, from her previous marriage, embracing fatherhood with the fervor of someone who knew firsthand what it meant to grow up without a father. "I wanted to be the father I never had," he would later reflect. Present, constant, loving. While Cassandra continued to land film roles, including, ironically, a small part as a Bond girl in For Your Eyes Only, Pierce struggled to break through in London's competitive theatre scene. The financial pressure of supporting a family of 4 pushed him toward television, where in 1982 he landed the role that would change everything: American detective Remington Steele. The NBC series required the family to relocate to California, uprooting their lives but offering the promise of stability. As the charming con-man-turned-detective, Brosnan's natural elegance and subtle humor captivated American audiences. The once-abandoned boy from Ireland was now a heartthrob in living rooms across the United States. But success came with its price. The grueling television schedule, 18-hour days, month after month, meant Pierce was often absent from his own family, echoing the pattern he had sworn to break. "The irony wasn't lost on me," he would later admit. "I became the father who wasn't there, even though I was doing it all to provide the security I never had." In 1986, just as Remington Steele was winding down, Albert Cubby Broccoli offered Pierce the role he had dreamed about since that afternoon in the Putney Cinema: James Bond. The offer seemed to represent everything Pierce had worked for: international recognition, financial security, the culmination of a journey from abandoned child to global icon. Then came the first cruel twist. NBC, seeing renewed interest in their star, exercised a contract option they had previously ignored, forcing Pierce to return for a final season of Remington Steele. The Bond role went to Timothy Dalton instead. The dream that had been within his grasp vanished overnight. "It was devastating," Pierce acknowledged years later. "I'd been measured for the suit, I'd held the gun. Then, suddenly, nothing." But this professional disappointment paled in comparison to what came next. In 1987, Cassandra fell ill. What began as unexplained fatigue was diagnosed as ovarian cancer. For 4 years, Pierce watched the vibrant woman who had changed his life battle an implacable enemy. December 28, 1991. In their Los Angeles home, with Pierce holding her hand, Cassandra took her final breath. She was just 43 years old. Pierce was 38, suddenly a widower with 3 children, including a biological son, Sean, born in 1983. I was in a helpless state of confusion and anger, Pierce would later describe of the period following Cassandra's death. It's the most horrific thing to watch someone you love have their life eaten away bit by this insidious disease. But life, with its brutal indifference, demanded he continue. The children needed stability. Bills had to be paid. So Pierce did what he had learned to do since childhood. He kept moving forward, burying his grief beneath work. The 1990s brought a string of films that showcased his range beyond the suave characters that had made him famous. The Lawn Mower, Man, Mrs. Doubtfire, Mars Attacks. He threw himself into environmental activism alongside his new partner, journalist Keely Shea Smith, whom he met in 1994. And then, in a remarkable turn of fate, the role of James Bond returned to him. GoldenEye in 1995 marked Pierce's debut as 007, nearly a decade after he had first been offered the part. The film grossed over $350 million worldwide, the highest ever take for a Bond film at that time. The abandoned boy who once watched Bond films for escape had become the very embodiment of the character. 3 more Bond films followed. Tomorrow Never Dies in 1997, The World Is Not Enough in 1999, and Die Another Day in 2002. Pierce brought to the role not just the required sophistication and danger, but also a vulnerability previous Bonds had rarely displayed. Perhaps it was the grief he carried, visible in quiet moments beneath the action hero veneer. By the early 2000s, Pierce had seemingly rebuilt his life. He had married Keely in 2001, welcoming sons Dylan and Paris. His career extended beyond Bond, with critical success in films like The Thomas Crown Affair. After the childhood defined by absence and the devastating loss of Cassandra, it appeared Pierce had finally found stable ground. But then came the phone call that would shatter this hard-won peace and force Pierce to relive his worst nightmare. June 28, 2013. Pierce was in Serbia filming The November Man when his phone rang. On the other end of the line, his stepdaughter Charlotte, Cassandra's biological daughter, whom he had raised as his own since she was 8, was calling with news that sent him reeling back to 1991. At 41, just 2 years younger than her mother had been, Charlotte had been diagnosed with the same ovarian cancer that had taken Cassandra. Unlike the gradual decline that had given Pierce years to prepare for Cassandra's death, Charlotte's cancer was discovered late, already aggressively metastasized. Within 2 weeks of that phone call, on June 28, 2013, Charlotte died, leaving behind 2 children of her own. The genetic cruelty of the disease that had now claimed both his wife and daughter left Pierce devastated. To watch someone you love have their life eaten away, bit by bit, day by day, by this insidious disease. It becomes an indelible part of your psyche, he told reporters, his voice breaking despite his attempt at composure. I've lost both my wife and my daughter to ovarian cancer. There's just no words. In the span of a single lifetime, Pierce Brosnan had become both the abandoned child and the bereaved parent, experiencing the full circle of familial tragedy. The actor who had played indestructible heroes now stood powerless against the most implacable villain of all, mortality itself. The years following Charlotte's death marked a period of profound darkness for Pierce. Though he continued to work, filming, promoting, showing up on set with the professionalism that had defined his career, those closest to him recognized the weight he carried. The loss had reopened every wound, forcing him to confront not just fresh grief, but the accumulated trauma of a lifetime. I don't think you ever get over it, he admitted in a rare, unguarded moment during a 2015 interview. You learn to live with it, you learn to rise with it at dawn, and you breathe deep for the new day. This period coincided with another professional blow. After 4 successful films as James Bond, having reclaimed the role that once slipped from his grasp, Pierce was unceremoniously dropped from the franchise via phone call in 2004. Though this had occurred before Charlotte's death, the combined effect of professional rejection and personal tragedy created a perfect storm of midlife crisis. For a man whose identity had been so intertwined with the suave, capable characters he portrayed, the contrast between his on-screen invincibility and his real-life helplessness in the face of cancer created a cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm him. There were days when getting out of bed seemed impossible, he later confessed. You go through the motions because you must. The world doesn't stop turning because your heart is breaking. Pierce turned increasingly to painting during this period, a solitary pursuit that allowed him to express the turbulence he felt without words. His abstract canvases, splashed with dark colors and jagged lines, revealed more about his emotional state than any interview could. Alcohol, which had been a comfort during the dark days after Cassandra's death, again became a dangerous temptation. Though Pierce never publicly acknowledged a dependency, friends worried about his increased drinking. You look for anything to numb the pain, one close associate quoted him as saying. But eventually you realize the pain is the only thing reminding you that they were real. The physical toll of grief manifested in other ways. Pierce, once lauded for his fitness and appearance, aged visibly in the years following Charlotte's death. The silver hair that had once been distinguished now seemed to weigh heavy on his brow. The lines around his eyes deepened not just with age, but with a sorrow that no acting role could alleviate. Work, which had always been his salvation, now struggled to hold his interest. Films like The November Man in 2014 and No Escape in 2015, while showcasing his enduring talent, lacked the spark that had defined his earlier performances. Critics noted a new heaviness to his presence on screen, a gravity that, while compelling, suggested an actor carrying burdens beyond the script. In one particularly poignant scene from his 2014 film The Love Punch, Pierce's character discusses the pain of loss with Emma Thompson's character. Though the film was a light comedy, the moment resonated with uncomfortable authenticity. Those weren't glycerin tears, the director would later reveal. We had to stop filming several times. It was too raw. His relationship with his sons, Sean from his marriage to Cassandra, and Dylan and Paris with Keeley, grew complicated during this period. Pierce, haunted by his own experience of paternal abandonment, was determined to remain present in their lives. Yet the very grief that drove this determination also created emotional barriers. How could he protect them from life's cruelties when he himself had been so brutally reminded of their inevitability? For Sean, who had lost both his mother and sister to the same disease, the fear of genetic predisposition became a specter hanging over every health concern. Father and son shared not just blood, but a specific trauma that few could comprehend. We don't talk about it often, Sean revealed in a rare interview, but it's always there between us, this understanding. Sometimes a look says more than words ever could. Christmas 2013, the first without Charlotte, proved especially difficult. The holiday that had once been a celebration of family now served as a stark reminder of absence. Photos from that period show a Pierce who seems diminished, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he stands beside a festive tree with Keeley and their sons. The hardest part, he would later share, is the ordinary moments. Not the anniversaries or birthdays, but the random Tuesday when you see something she would have loved, reach for the phone, and then remember all over again. By 2015, Pierce had retreated significantly from public life. Red carpet appearances were limited to professional obligations, interviews became increasingly rare, and when he did speak publicly, he deflected personal questions with the skill of a man who had spent decades in the spotlight. Yet even in this darkness, small embers of resilience began to glow. The same strength that had carried the abandoned boy from Navan to Hollywood would not allow Pierce Brosnan to surrender entirely to grief. By his late 60s, a different Pierce Brosnan began to emerge from the shadow of loss. Not unmarked by tragedy, the pain remained visible in quiet moments, but somehow integrated with it, as if grief had become not just a burden, but a lens through which he viewed the world with new clarity. "You either sink or swim," he told The Guardian in 2017, "and I chose to swim, though there were times the tide was awfully strong." This period saw Pierce embrace roles that reflected a new willingness to explore vulnerability on screen. In The Foreigner in 2017, he played a morally ambiguous former IRA member, a far cry from the heroic figures of his earlier career. In Mamma Mia, 2008 and its 2018 sequel, he displayed a self-deprecating humor about his singing abilities that the younger, image-conscious Pierce might have avoided. The man who had once been so closely identified with James Bond's invulnerability now seemed comfortable revealing his own humanity, flaws, fears, and all. His relationship with Keeley, which had weathered the storm of Charlotte's death, deepened into something media-obsessed Hollywood rarely sees, an authentic partnership based on mutual respect and enduring affection. Photos of them walking hand in hand along Malibu beaches or at charity events revealed a couple still genuinely connected after decades together. When trolls on social media commented on Keeley's weight gain over the years, Pierce's response was swift and unequivocal. "I love every curve of her body. She has been my North Star, my anchor through it all." The pain of losing Cassandra and Charlotte to ovarian cancer transformed into purposeful activism. Pierce became a vocal advocate for cancer research, using his platform to raise awareness and funds. If speaking about our experience helps even one family get an earlier diagnosis or pushes research forward by a single day, then exposing that private pain is worth it, he explained at a 2018 Stand Up to Cancer event. His artistic pursuits expanded beyond acting. The painting that had once been merely therapeutic evolved into a serious creative outlet. In 2018, he sold one of his original works for $1.4 million at a charity auction, the proceeds going to cancer research. The abstract canvas, a riot of color emerging from darkness, seemed to visually represent his own journey. With his sons grown, Pierce embraced his role as grandfather to Charlotte's children. "When I look at her children, I see her in them," he shared in a 2019 interview. "It's both painful and beautiful, a reminder that something of those we lose lives on." Now in his 70s, Pierce has found a certain peace in accepting life's impermanence. The Irish Catholic boy who once questioned why God would allow such suffering has arrived at a spiritual understanding that transcends dogma. "I still have faith," he told an interviewer in 2020, "but it's evolved into something more personal. The God I believe in now is one who doesn't prevent tragedy, but somehow helps us endure it." His career, too, has found a new balance. No longer driven by the need to prove himself or secure his family's future, Pierce now chooses projects that genuinely interest him, regardless of their commercial potential. Indie films like The Greatest in 2009 and Some Kind of Beautiful in 2014 allowed him to explore character nuances that blockbusters rarely afford. The man who once felt compelled to project strength at all costs now speaks openly about the importance of emotional vulnerability, particularly for men. We're taught to soldier on, to never show weakness, he reflected in a 2021 GQ interview. But there's more courage in allowing yourself to be broken than in pretending you're unbreakable. At 72, Pierce Brosnan embodies a particular kind of masculine grace, one that acknowledges wounds rather than hiding them, that finds strength in survival rather than in vulnerability. The abandoned boy who became a global icon, who became a grieving husband and father, has now emerged as something else entirely: a man. At peace with his own story, however painful its chapters. "What I know now that I didn't know then," he shared on his 70th birthday, "is that loss doesn't diminish love. It distills it to its essence. The people I've lost are still with me, not as ghosts, but as guides." In an industry that worships youth and often discards its aging stars, Pierce has achieved something remarkable. A third act defined not by desperation to recapture past glories, but by authentic evolution. The silver hair, the lined face that once made him Bond, now give gravitas to characters allowed to show the weight of experience. Today, Pierce divides his time between film projects, painting, environmental activism, and family. His Malibu home, far from the hardscrabble streets of his childhood, serves as both sanctuary and gathering place for the family he has fought so hard to protect and nurture. If there's a lesson in it all, he reflected recently, perhaps it's that we don't get to choose what happens to us, only how we respond. And sometimes responding well means simply continuing to put one foot in front of the other until you find solid ground again. As the California sunset casts long shadows across the sand, Pierce tucks the worn photograph back into his pocket and rinses his paintbrush in the tide. 7 decades of life, marked by abandonment, achievement, devastating loss, and hard-won peace, have led him to this moment of quiet reflection. The boy from Navan who dreamed of becoming James Bond became not just the character, but something far more significant. A man who has faced life's most brutal realities without surrendering to bitterness or despair. What remains after tragedy is not the absence of pain, but the presence of something pain cannot destroy: the capacity to continue loving, creating, and finding meaning even when the world has taken what cannot be replaced. Pierce Brosnan's journey reminds us that resilience isn't about avoiding wounds, but about carrying them with dignity, allowing them to deepen rather than diminish our humanity. If this story moved you, please tap like and share it with someone who might need to be reminded of the strength hiding within us all. Which part of Pierce's journey resonates most deeply with you? The childhood abandonments that shaped him, the devastating losses he endured, or the peace he eventually found? Sometimes, in sharing what breaks our hearts, we discover how strong they've become in the mending. In the end, perhaps the true measure of a life isn't found in moments of triumph or tragedy, but in the quiet courage it takes to face each new morning, paintbrush in hand, ready to transform darkness into something beautiful.